In May of 1893, a property manager named Halbert Crane walked the north boundary of the Pershing grain land outside Millhaven, Missouri. He was checking fence posts and drainage, the kind of work that requires boots and a notebook and very little thought. When he reached the ravine on the north edge of the property, he stopped. There was a section of limestone dry stacking built into the east wall of the cut, running about 18 feet across, fitted tight each stone chosen for its flat faces and seated against the next with a precision that did not belong to nature. Crane stood there for a while. He looked at the wall. He looked at the overhang above it, 8 feet of solid rock extending from the cliff face like a ceiling that had been there since before anyone had a word for ceiling. He looked at the doorway space framed by two flat stones set on end. He looked at the gap between the top of the wall and the rock above 2 feet of open air that would have let in light and let out smoke in equal measure. He wrote in his notebook, possible old livestock, shelter condition stable, no action required. The note remained in the Pershing land records unvisited and unexplained for 11 years. 4 years before Crane wrote that note, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1889, a woman named Verity Briggs climbed down into that same ravine, carrying everything she owned. She was 28 years old. She had a horse tied at the rim above. She had a carpenter's adze that had belonged to her father. She had $41 sewn into the lining of her winter coat. And she had a knowledge of that particular piece of ground that no one else alive possessed because no one else had ever thought the ground was worth knowing. This is the story of what she built there and why she built it and what it cost and what it gave back. It begins not in the ravine but in a kitchen 4 years earlier, on the afternoon when a man named Cornelius Briggs gave his daughter a carpenter's adze as a wedding gift and a family received it in silence. The Briggs house in Millhaven County was a carpenter's house in the specific sense that every surface in it showed the hand of a person who understood what wood was for and how to bring out what was already in it. The kitchen table was cherry the grain, showing through a finish applied with care. The shelves were fitted to the wall with joints that did not creak or pull. The stairs rose at an angle that Cornelius had calculated over 3 days before he cut a single board, because the angle of a staircase determines everything that follows, and a man who does not measure before he cuts wastes both the wood and the work. Cornelius Briggs was not a man who made speeches. He expressed what mattered to him through the things he built and the tools he maintained and the way he showed his daughter how to walk a job site before picking up a tool, which is to say, he moved through the space first slowly and paid attention, and only then decided what was needed. He gave Verity the adze on the morning of her wedding, not in ceremony. He set it on the kitchen table and said this was your grandfather's before it was mine, and she understood that was the entirety of the speech. The adze was a small tool narrower than a hatchet, the blade set perpendicular to the handle so that it could plane a surface or shape a curve that a straight blade could not follow. It was old enough that the handle had been replaced twice, and the blade had been sharpened so many times over so many decades that it was narrower than it had been when new, reduced by use to its essential shape. It was the kind of tool that a man who understood tools recognized immediately, and the kind of tool that a man who did not understand them received in polite silence. The Prescott family received it in polite silence. Verity saw this. She was 24 years old, and she had her father's habit of seeing what was actually in front of her rather than what she expected to see. She saw the particular quality of the silence in the Prescott parlor that morning. She saw the way Edmund Prescott, her future father-in-law, looked at the adze and then looked away. The look of a man who has been presented with something he does not know how to value and who does not consider that a deficiency in himself. She said nothing. She put the adze in her trunk and kept it there, and over the 4 years that followed, she kept it in the barn. When she arrived at the Prescott farm on a shelf above the secondary workbench near the back wall, and not once in 4 years did any member of the Prescott family ask her about it. The Prescott farm occupied 40 acres of river bottom land in Millhaven County, Missouri. The land had been in the Prescott name since before the territory became a state, which was the fact that Edmund Prescott valued above all other facts about his own existence. He mentioned it with the frequency and tone of a man who considers a thing to be the foundational truth of his world and believes that the world shares this assessment. His son Aldous was 27 when he married Verity. He was a quiet man whose quietness was not the quietness of depth. It was the quietness of a man who has grown up in the presence of a father who fills all available silence and has learned that the easiest response to that presence is to occupy as little space as possible. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was the kind of man who fails the people around him, not through intention, but through the particular absence of intention that amounts over years to the same thing. Verity was not naive when she married him. She was 24, and she had grown up in a house where materials were assessed honestly before being used, and she applied the same assessment to the situation in front of her. She knew Aldous was not romantic. She knew the Prescotts valued land the way other families valued blood, absolutely and without negotiation, and that anything that was not land was therefore of secondary importance, including the people who worked that land. She thought the absence of romance could be compensated by stability. She was wrong about this. She needed 4 years to understand exactly where the error lay. The first year she rebuilt the kitchen garden. The garden had been allowed to go to hard clay and pokeweed over the previous 3 years since the last woman who tended it had died, and no one had thought to replace what that woman's labor had produced. Verity cleared the beds by hand, working from the fence inward, removing the pokeweed and its roots, which go deep and come back if you leave any part of them. She composted through the winter building piles at the south end of the plot where the frost would do its work and the spring warmth would arrive first. She tracked the sunlight across the garden in every season, noting where the shadow of the barn fell in July and where it fell in March, adjusting her planting accordingly. By the following summer, the garden was feeding the household and producing surplus for the root cellar. Beans, tomatoes, late squash, pickled beets in labeled jars on the lower shelves. She wrote the dates on the labels in her own handwriting. A habit her father had taught her: a label without a date is an approximation, and approximations compound. Edmund Prescott walked past the garden on an afternoon in late July. He stopped. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the rows. He said, "This one knows how to work." His voice carried the tone of a man inspecting a new piece of equipment and finding it satisfactory. Verity was at the far end of the garden, and she heard every word. She heard the distinction between praising the work and praising the worker. She heard the word "this one," which was not a name and was not a person, and which placed her in the same category as the soil and the tools and the fence posts. She filed this distinction away without responding, because she had not yet learned to fully trust her own instincts about the Prescott family, and because she still believed in that first year that being useful and being valued were the same thing. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing, but she had not yet accumulated enough evidence to know this with certainty, and she was a woman who required evidence before she reached conclusions. The second year she learned the land. This was not the land as Edmund described it, 40 acres of river-bottom farmland carrying the Prescott name since statehood. This was the land as a physical fact, which is a different thing entirely. She walked it the way her father had taught her to walk a job site, which was slowly and with attention, not looking for anything specific, simply moving through the space and letting the space speak. The soil shifted from clay to loam at a depth of about 3 feet along the western field. She found this out by digging test holes at intervals, which was not something anyone had asked her to do, and which she did anyway because the information was useful, and gathering it cost nothing but time. The spring that fed the stock tank in the north pasture ran cold in August when the other springs on the property warmed. She located the seep where it emerged from the limestone shelf under the ridge and understood that it was drawing from a different aquifer than the surface springs, deeper and more consistent. She mapped the drainage patterns after heavy rain, tracking where the water collected in the low corner of the east pasture and how long it sat before the ground absorbed it. She understood these things. Aldous did not. Edmund did not. The Prescott men knew the land the way you know, a room where you have always lived, which is to say they knew its surfaces and its habits, but not its structure. They had owned this land for generations without ever fully learning it. Verity knew it in 2 years. She also knew by the end of the second year the content of the conversations that happened on the porch in the evenings when she was washing dishes in the kitchen with the window open. The window faced the back porch. Sound traveled through that window the way all sounds travel between adjacent spaces, through whatever gap the builder left, and the builder of the Prescott farmhouse had left a gap of about 3 inches between the window frame and the outer sill, which was enough. She heard the conversation the first time in the second autumn. She heard Aldous say her name. She heard Edmund respond in the slow, deliberate tone he used when stating facts he considered settled. She heard the word children used not as a noun, but as a measure the way you would use a word that describes a crop or a yield. She set down the dish she was washing and stood at the sink with the towel in her hands and did not move. She heard the conversation the second time 3 months later. The third time she heard Aldous say it plainly, she knows the dirt, but she does not know how to be a wife. Verity stood at the sink with the water cooling around her wrists. She did not cry. She wrung out the towel, hung it on the hook, and went to bed. She did not mention what she had heard because a thing overheard is not a conversation. It is information, and information in her experience was more useful when stored quietly than when confronted directly. She was filing it. She was building a picture. She was doing what her father had taught her to do before she touched a tool, which was to understand the full situation before deciding what it required. The third year, she began her own work. She had been mending clothes for the household since the first month of her marriage, which was not unusual, and which no one had asked her to do, but which had become part of the structure of the household. The way all work becomes invisible when it is done consistently and well by people whose invisibility is considered normal. She was good at the work. Her mother had taught her the technique at age 11, press the fold twice, before stitching, stitch twice before cutting, which added time to every hem, but produced work that held through 50 washings without pulling or fraying. In the third year, she began taking work from outside the household. 3 women in Millhaven found her through the process by which women in small towns find a good seamstress, which is by asking each other and which produces reliable results because women who ask each other for recommendations have a direct stake in the accuracy of the answer. They came to the side door. She took their fabric and their instructions, and she delivered finished work on the schedule she named. And the work was what it had always been. Seams that did not pull buttonholes, that did not fray hems, that fell level after a season's worth of wear. She was paid in cash. The cash went into the lining of her winter coat, which hung on a hook in the bedroom closet where nobody looked because nobody had reason to look. There was no malice in this arrangement. She was not stealing. The money she earned with her own hands was by any reasonable measure her own. But she had learned by the third year that keeping things required not telling anyone you had them, and so she did not tell anyone, and the coat grew heavier in small increments through that third year and into the fourth. She was not saving toward anything specific. She was saving because a woman who has begun to understand her situation clearly will always save what she can, the way a person who sees weather coming on the horizon does not wait to close the windows. In the third year also she met Dorothea Vane. Dorothea was 55 years old and had been a widow for 8 years. She farmed 10 acres that bordered the Prescott land to the west, and she ran the place herself with the assistance of one hired hand during planting and harvest, and her own labor through the rest of the year. She had survived her husband's death by being the kind of woman who responded to difficulty by making a list of what was actually in front of her and then working down the list. She had survived 8 years alone by the same method. She was not sentimental. She was practical in the way that some people become practical when sentiment has cost them more than they can afford, which is to say, absolutely and without apology. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and she did not say much, which made the things she did say land with a weight that most people's longer speeches never achieved. Verity had seen Dorothea at the quarterly market and at church twice a year, and had exchanged the standard courtesies. Nothing more until the third year, when Dorothea came to the Prescott gate in September carrying a jar of sourwood honey and knocked. They sat on the porch and drank coffee. Dorothea looked at the garden, which was at the end of its season, the stalks cut back and the beds mulched, and the rows visible as a pattern in the dark soil. She said nothing about the garden for a while. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, which was the way you look at something when you are determining its actual quality rather than its surface appearance. Then she said, "Your father is a carpenter down in Clary County, isn't he?" Verity said yes. Dorothea said, "I can tell." The garden has structure. A lot of people plant in rows. You plant it in a system. Verity did not answer, and Dorothea did not expect her to, and the conversation moved on to other things. But Verity held that observation. Being seen specifically and accurately by someone who asked for nothing in return was not a sensation she had experienced recently. She was not sure she had experienced it at all since she had come to live on the Prescott farm. The fourth year, Aldous moved his things to the spare room. He did not announce this. He did not explain. One afternoon, while Verity was in the garden, he moved his clothing from the wardrobe in the bedroom they had shared for 3 years to the smaller wardrobe in the room down the hall where they had stored extra quilts and boxes of things without immediate use. She came in at dusk and noticed the space where his clothing had been, the absence of his boots beside the bed, the single pillow on the side of the bed that had been his. She stood in the doorway and waited for what the moment would produce. What came was not sadness, it was lightness. She stood in that doorway and felt herself lighter, and she hated the feeling because it meant she had already given up before she knew she had given up, which meant the giving up had happened silently, without her fully witnessing it at some point in the past 3 years that she could not identify. And a thing she could not identify was a thing she could not properly understand. And a thing she could not understand was a gap in the picture she had been building. She closed the bedroom door and went to the kitchen and finished the mending she had due on Friday. Because the mending was due on Friday and it needed to be done. It was Dorothea who said it out loud. She came on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of the 4th year, the way she came sometimes without announcement, with a part of something or a cutting from the kitchen garden, and a direct gaze in the manner of a woman who considers pleasantries to be a poor use of both parties' time. She poured the coffee. They sat on the porch, and Dorothea looked at Verity the way she looked at everything directly, and she said, "Aldous is not going to keep you. The Prescotts do not keep wives who do not bear children. You should start thinking about what comes next." Verity set down her cup. She was not angry because Dorothea was wrong. She was angry because Dorothea was right. There is a particular kind of fury in being told what you already know by someone who had no obligation to soften it. The knowledge was not new. The picture she had been building for 4 years had been pointing in this direction for most of those years, and she had been building it carefully and accurately. But there is a difference between knowing something and having another person say it plainly in the afternoon light of your own porch. She stood up. She said, "Thank you for the coffee." She left. She did not visit Dorothea again. She walked home and worked through the evening and lay down that night and stared at the ceiling and felt the full weight of having punished honesty because she was not ready for it. She would remember that later. She would remember it, specifically the particular waste of it, the way she had walked away from the one person who had been watching her clearly and saying what she saw. In November of 1888, Verity found the overhang. She was walking the north fence looking for a gap she had heard the cattle were using. The fence ran along the top of a ravine that the Prescotts called the drainage ditch, which told you everything about how much attention they had ever paid to it. They had owned the land long enough for the name to have calcified into a fact, and a thing that has been called the drainage ditch for 40 years stops being examined and simply is. Verity had walked the ravine path before. She knew it ran about 600 feet through a limestone cut before opening into the creek that fed the river. She knew the walls rose 12 feet on either side. She knew the creek ran clear and cold from the springs upstream. What she had not known until that November afternoon was that the overhang on the east wall of the ravine, at the deepest point of the cut, was not a ledge. It was a roof. She had gone down into the ravine to check the post at the bottom of the fence line, and when the rain came, she stepped under the overhang and stood there. The rain fell 6 feet in front of her straight down, and the clay bank behind her was dry as powder. 8 feet of solid limestone ceiling above her, the face of the cliff rising vertically behind the ravine walls climbing on either side. The creek running 20 feet below down a gentle slope of mossy stone. She stood there for 20 minutes. The rain fell in front of her and did not touch her. The wind that had been following her along the fence line stopped at the overhang's edge and divided, half going left and half going right. The way wind always divides at a curved surface, finding no flat face to push against. Behind the overhang, the air was still and cool and carried the mineral smell of limestone that has been doing this for longer than anyone alive could calculate. Verity stood at the back of that dry clay bank with the rain falling in front of her and the solid stone above her, and she thought the thought that would change the direction of the next 4 years of her life. This is already a room. It simply has not been finished. She did not tell Aldous. She was not certain afterward why she had not. Perhaps because it felt like something she had found for herself, and what Verity found for herself she had learned over 4 years of marriage to keep quiet about until she knew what she intended to do with it. She intended to do something with it. She walked back to the house in the rain and said nothing. The end came on a Thursday in early October of 1889. Verity walked in from the garden at noon and knew before she reached the kitchen door. The knowing came from the quality of the silence, the kind that fills a house after a conversation has already concluded, and what remains is the formality of announcement. Edmund was at the kitchen table. Aldous stood by the window with his back to the room. From the hallway behind the kitchen, she heard a door close softly. Aldous' mother. The precise, careful sound of a latch catching the sound of a woman who knew what was about to happen and had chosen not to be present for it. Verity noted this sound and added it to the picture she had been building. This final piece, the woman who had said nothing for 4 years, closing a door rather than witnessing the end of that silence. Edmund spoke without looking up. The marriage had not taken. Those were his words. Had not taken, as if it were a graft on a fruit tree, a thing that either bonds to the host or does not, and if it does not, you cut it clean and move forward, because sentiment does not improve soil, and a failed graft does not improve with patience. 3 days. They were giving her a horse which was generous by their accounting. She could see them believing this, the way people believe in the generosity of gestures that cost them nothing they intended to keep. They kept the house, the barn, the root cellar with its jars of beans and tomatoes and pickled beets in her handwriting. The kitchen garden she had built over 4 years, from hard clay and pokeweed into something that produced. The 40 acres of river-bottom farmland that the Prescott name had sat on since before the territory became a state. Verity did not cry. She asked one question. She said, "What about the garden?" Edmund looked at her the way you look at someone who has asked the time at a funeral. His voice was entirely without effect. "The garden is on Prescott land." 7 words. 4 years of composting and clearing and planting and mapping sunlight through every season, dismissed in 7 words by a man who had never once walked to the end of the second row. She looked at Aldous. He did not turn around. She would remember this longer than she remembered anything else from the 4 years of her marriage. Not his face, not his voice. The back of his neck turned away from her while his father ended her life in that house. The posture of a man who has agreed to a thing and cannot bear to watch it happen, which was perhaps the most Aldous thing she had ever seen him do. She had 3 days. She used them. The first night after Edmund had gone to bed and Aldous had retreated to the room where he was sleeping, now Verity walked through the Prescott house one last time. She did it the way her father had taught her to walk a job site, slowly with attention, touching the surfaces and reading them. Not because she wanted to remember the house, because she wanted to see it clearly exactly as it was without the softening that sentiment adds to things we have lived inside for years. The kitchen table where she had eaten 1,000 meals without being asked about a single one. She placed her hand flat on the surface, felt the grain under her palm. The root cellar door which she opened and stood in the frame of looking at the rows of jars she had filled the beans and tomatoes and the pickled beets, her handwriting on every label, her labor in every jar. She had enough provision in this alair to carry the household through February without buying at the store. The house would not understand this until February. She went to the garden in the dark and stood among the rows she had built from nothing. She pressed her hand flat against the soil the way she would press her hand against limestone later, to feel whether the thing beneath her was solid. And it was solid. It had been solid from the day she began improving it, and it did not belong to her. She went inside and did not look at the garden again. The first day she went to the barn and took the ads from the shelf above the secondary workbench. It had been her father's before it was hers, and it was hers regardless of what any deed said. She also took a book on farm construction from the shelf in the parlor, a book Edmund had bought years ago and never opened the spine, still unmarked the pages, still holding the stiffness of a volume that has been stored rather than read. She was not stealing a book. She was removing knowledge from a shelf where it was not being used and placing it in the hands of someone who intended to use it. She packed her sewing kit, her bedroll, and the winter coat with the $41 in the lining. The second day she rode into Millhaven, she did not buy anything. She walked slowly through the main street observing. She noted the dry goods store operated by a man of about 50 who stood behind his counter the way a fence post stands in a field present, in vertical and disinclined to unnecessary movement. She noted the hours he opened and closed, the rhythm of the customers who came and went, the particular quality of a man who said what he meant and nothing more. She was not shopping, she was planning. There is a difference, and Verity had always been able to feel the difference. The third day she put on the winter coat and packed the bedroll and her sewing kit and the ads into the saddlebags. She loaded the horse at the Prescott gate in the early morning before anyone in the house was moving. She rode south on the main road for less than a mile. Then she turned west. She followed the fence line for another half-mile to where the Vane property met the road. She stopped her horse at Dorothea's gate. Dorothea came out onto the porch. She was wearing her work clothes, a dark dress and leather boots, with the laces double knotted the clothes of a woman who had already been up for 2 hours. She came to the porch rail and looked at Verity the way she always looked at things. She said, "Do you know where you are going?" Verity said yes, and then she turned her horse and rode north, was south toward the county line where Aldous had assumed she would go, not east toward Springfield where her sister Rosalind had a spare room and had twice written to say she would be glad to see Verity when Verity was ready to come. Not any direction that anyone in Millhaven County would have considered if they had been asked where Verity Briggs had gone, because the directions people expect you to take are the directions that lead away from things, and Verity was not going away from anything. She was going towards something. She rode north along the fence line that bordered the Prescott property through the stand of white oak and hickory that the Prescotts had never bothered to clear because the ground under it was too rocky to farm down the slope into the creek drainage, and along the path she had walked a dozen times checking fence lines and studying drainage. She rode until she could go no further on horseback, until the ravine cut deepened and the path narrowed to a ledge above the water, and she tied the horse to an oak at the rim. Dorothea stood on her porch and watched until the horse and rider disappeared into the tree line. She did not say where Verity had gone to anyone who asked. She did not say that Verity had ridden north instead of south. She noted these things in the deep place where she kept everything she saw, and she kept them there because Dorothea Vane understood that some things you witnesses are not yours to speak about. She went inside and fed her chickens. Verity climbed down into the ravine. She went over the rim with the saddlebags across her shoulder, using the exposed oak roots for footholds the way she had used them before when she had come to check the fence post. The limestone was slick with the morning's dew. She moved slowly, and she did not fall. At the bottom, she stood in the creek bed and looked up at the overhang she had stood under in the rain 14 months before. The November light came down through the bare branches above the ravine rim and laid itself across the limestone wall in pale strips. The creek ran low and cold over the gravel. The clay bank beneath the overhang was dry. The rock above it extended 8 feet out from the cliff face, solid and unchanged, indifferent to the passage of 14 months in the specific gravity of what she was standing there deciding. She looked at the space for a long time. She looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at a foundation, for she poured it, measuring the actual dimensions against the dimensions in her mind, checking for the gap between what she had imagined and what was actually there. There was no gap. It was exactly what she had remembered. 18 feet of horizontal coverage running along the east wall, 12 feet of depth from the face of the cliff to the lip where the overhang ended, 8 feet of clearance at the highest point, a floor of packed clay and river gravel level enough to stand on and work on and sleep on if you built it up. She reached into the saddlebag and took out the adze. The wood of the handle was smooth from years of use, worn to the shape of the hands that had used it. Her grandfather's hands first, then her father's, now hers. She held it the way her father had taught her to hold it, the weight resting in the palm rather than grip tight, the blade ready. She set the saddlebags down against the cliff face. She stood in the center of the space that was not yet a room and looked at the open western end where the wind came through and the ravine path was visible to anyone who walked below. The wall was the first problem. She would start with the wall. Part 2, our Teen Days 3 Winters. The wall was the first problem and the only problem that could not wait. Without a wall across the western opening, the space beneath the overhang was a windbreak and nothing more. The prevailing weather in Millhaven County came from the west and northwest, which meant that without a wall, every fire she built would heat the open air above the ravine. Every night she slept, there would be a night in the open country with a ceiling of rock and nothing else. The ceiling mattered. The ceiling was what had stopped her in the rain 14 months before. But a ceiling without walls was architecture for a different kind of life than the one she was trying to build. She spent the first full day selecting stone. The ravine floor and lower walls were rich with limestone rubble pieces that had been working free of the bedrock for centuries and had come to rest wherever gravity and the creek's occasional flooding had deposited them. Some of it was useless, rounded, and irregular, the kind of stone that will not stack because it has no flat face to rest against its neighbor. Some of it was exactly what she needed, Slabs that had split from the parent formation along natural planes of weakness, leaving surfaces that were not perfectly smooth, but were flat enough for the purpose which was all that mattered. She moved through the rubble, slowly testing each candidate piece by setting it on the ground and pressing at its edges. A stone that rocked was a stone she put back. A stone that sat without movement she carried to the base of the overhang and set in a row. By mid-afternoon, she had a supply. By evening, she had established the footprint of the wall, setting the first course of foundation stones along the line she had decided on, which left her a doorway space of about 3 feet slightly to the left of center, framed on each side by the largest and most nearly vertical stones in her collection. She slept that night on her bedroll under the overhang, with the first course of the wall at her feet, the overhang above her, and the October stars visible through the ravine's open top in the narrow strip of sky between the rims. The creek made its sound. The air came down from the ridges and moved through the ravine with the particular chill of high country in autumn. Not yet the killing cold of December, but the announcement of what December intended. She was not comfortable. She was not in danger. The distinction between those two states was the only one that mattered. She ate dried biscuit from the saddlebag and drank from the creek and lay down and thought about the second course of the wall until she fell asleep. On the second and third days she built. She had read the principle in the farm construction book she had taken from the Prescott parlor, and she had seen the technique applied to the Prescott spring house on the east edge of the property. Dry stacking, each stone laid without mortar, the weight of the wall held together by gravity, and the precision of fit. A wall built this way had no chemical bond to fail. What it had was physics. The weight of each stone pressing down on the stones below the slight inward batter of the courses, as they rose the way a curved or irregular face in one stone was accommodated by its neighbor, until the two pieces fit with the snugness of things that were made for each other and simply needed to be introduced. She worked from the corners toward the center and from the base upward, testing each placement with her palm before committing to it, pressing the stone in all four directions to check for wobble, because a stone that wobbles is a stone that transfers its movement to the stones around it, and movement accumulates the way debt accumulates invisibly, at first and then all at once. She rejected stones that did not sit true. She rotated stones until they sat without movement, and then she moved to the next course. The wall rose, not quickly, a day to reach knee height, another day to reach the level of her chest. On the third day, she found that she had developed a method without intending to the way your hands find a technique before your mind understands it, because the hands are in contact with the material and the mind is not. She was choosing stones by feel as much as by sight, learning the weight and texture of the limestone, with her palms understanding through the skin of her hands what her eyes confirmed. Her father had told her this would happen. He had said it the way he said most things, without ceremony, while they were working, while his hands were occupied with something specific. He had said the material tells you what it needs if you hold it long enough. Most people don't hold things long enough. They decide before the material has finished speaking. Verity had been 11 years old. She had been holding a board and trying to understand where to begin the cut. She had not fully understood the words at the time. She understood them now, with her hands full of limestone in a ravine in Milhaven County, Missouri, building a wall that no one had asked for and that no one knew was being built. On the fourth day, she began the chimney problem. She had known from the beginning that smoke was the problem that could end everything. Smoke rising from the ravine would be visible from the property road, above which ran along the north boundary of the Prescott land and was used regularly by the Prescott family, by their hired hands, and by the occasional neighbor crossing through. Visible smoke meant a visible fire. A visible fire meant someone coming to look. Someone coming to look meant the end of everything she was building before it was finished being built. She could not have a chimney that rose. Any chimney that rose through the ravine walls or above them would be visible from the rim. But she could not survive a Missouri winter without fire, and fire without a flue meant smoke in the enclosed space that would drive her out or kill her, or both. She thought about this problem for the entirety of the fourth day, while she worked on the wall, turning it from every angle, the way her father had turned a board before the first cut, looking for the grain line that would tell him where the wood wanted to go. The answer was in the clay bank. The clay bank behind the overhang extended back into the hillside for at least 12 feet before it met the solid limestone of the ridge above. Clay was not stone, but it was dense and workable, and her father had spent enough evenings explaining the physics of heat and draft that she knew the principle warm air rises, which means a flue needs to go up before it goes out. But warm air also moves through enclosed spaces along a pressure gradient, and a pressure gradient is a direction not necessarily vertical. If she could create a horizontal channel through the clay bank 12 feet long, running back into the hillside at a slight upward angle, the smoke would travel through it and emerge through the face of the cliff above. On the far side of the ridge's crest, dispersed through the mat of bur oak roots that had been threading down through the limestone for 60 years. By the time the smoke reached the surface, it would have cooled. It would disperse through the root network. In daylight, it would be invisible. In cold weather, it might show as a faint haziness, the kind of shimmer that rose from the creek every morning and that no one ever looked at twice. She began cutting the channel on the fourth evening after the wall work was done. She used the adze's corner edge to score the clay, then hollowed it out with her hands in a flat stone that served as a scraper. The clay was dense and the work was slow, and she went 3 feet that evening before the light failed. She had a long way to go, the fifth day. She was at the upper end of the clay channel working the adze into the densest section near the back of the bank when she heard the sound. Hoofbeats. Above her. On the property road that ran along the ravine rim. She heard them before she processed what she was hearing, the way sound reaches the body before it reaches the mind, and her body acted before she decided anything. She set the adze down without a sound. She moved to the base of the east wall and pressed her back flat against the limestone feet, together arms at her sides. The clay channel and the partially built wall were behind her. The overhang was above her. If anyone looked down from the rim, they would see the ravine floor, the creek, the rubble along the walls. They would not see her unless they looked directly down into the deepest section of the cut. She held her breath. The hoofbeats came along the road at a steady walking pace, not a horse being hurried. A horse covering familiar ground. She counted the steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound changed slightly as the rider reached the section of road that passed directly above her, where the limestone was closer to the surface, and the impact rang differently. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Silence. Not the silence of a man who has continued on, the silence of a man who has paused. She could hear the creek below her. She could hear the faint, regular sound of the horse shifting its weight on the packed earth of the road above. She could hear her own pulse in the sides of her throat, the specific drumming of a body that has received a signal it does not have language for yet, but that every cell in it understands. She did not move. She counted. She reached 100 and then started again. The horse shifted above her. The saddle leather made the small sound that leather makes when a rider adjusts their position, leaning, perhaps looking at something. Looking down into the ravine. She could not know what he saw from up there. She could only know that the wall was 4 courses high and the clay channel was a scar in the bank that was not natural, and that whether these things were visible from 30 feet above in October light was something she had not yet had the opportunity to test. The hoofbeats resumed. They continued along the road at the same walking pace they had arrived with, moving north, fading gradually into the ordinary background of wind and water until they were indistinguishable from everything else. She stayed against the wall for 15 minutes after the last sound. Her hands were shaking by the time she allowed herself to move, and she did not try to stop them, because shaking hands were information, and she was a woman who valued information. What her hands were telling her was what she had understood intellectually from the beginning, but not yet felt in her body, that building the wall was one problem. Keeping it invisible was a completely different problem. And the second problem would govern every decision she made from this day forward, because there was no version of the rest of this where discovery was acceptable. She went back to the clay channel and worked until it was too dark to work. But everything she did from that afternoon forward, the selection of stone, the angle of the wall, faced the positioning of the doorway, the depth at which she cut the drainage channel, later the color and texture of the materials she used, all of it was done with the second problem in mind, which was not concealment exactly. It was deeper than concealment. It was the understanding that the best hiding place is not the one that is difficult to reach, but the one that no one believes exists. A wall that looks like a natural limestone face is not a hidden wall. It is simply part of the ravine. She spent more time than she should have in the early days on the face of the wall. On choosing stones whose gray-brown weathering matched the existing cliff face, on setting them at the slight irregular angles that natural stone settles into over centuries, not plumb, not deliberately irregular, but the specific randomness that is not randomness, but the accumulated result of freeze and thaw in time. She left the top of the wall 2 feet below the overhanging ceiling, an open gap that would read from above as shadow, not as construction. On the fifth night, she finished the wall, and on the fifth night, she cried. She had not planned to. She would not have predicted it. She was not a woman who cried as a practice or as a response to difficulty, and the 5 days of building had been the most purposeful 5 days she had lived in 4 years, which meant they had been better days than most of what had come before. But she lay down on the bedroll behind the finished wall, and the temperature of the ground came up through the wool, the way cold always came up through anything you placed on limestone in October, steadily and without hurry and without any particular feeling about the matter. And her body, which had been burning through its reserves for 5 days, on dried biscuit and creek water, began to register the arithmetic of what it was actually inside. She was 28 years old. She was lying on a stone floor in a ravine in the Ozark Hills. Everything she owned was in 2 saddlebags and on her back. The horse was tied to an oak above the rim, and she had not been up to check on it since the afternoon. The wall she had just finished was 4 feet tall, and it was the finest thing she had owned since her father's house, which was a fact so bleak and so complete that she could not look at it sideways. She had to look at it directly, and looking at it directly, she cried. Not for the Prescott house, which had never been home, not from fear, which she had been too busy for. She cried because Dorothea Vane had been right, and she had walked away from Dorothea's porch rather than sit with the discomfort of hearing what she already knew. And now she was entirely alone in a way that made the loneliness of her marriage look like a crowded room. She cried because the limestone above her was solid and ancient and indifferent, and because indifference in the dark feels exactly like contempt. She cried because she was her father's daughter, and her father had built a house and a life, and a daughter who knew how to see what was in front of her, and what was in front of her was a clay floor and a wool blanket and $36 left in her coat lining. She gave herself 10 minutes. She had decided this before she lay down, the way she decided things that required deciding in advance before the moment arrived and the available options narrowed. 10 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and lay down again and thought about the chimney channel, specifically about the angle at which it needed to slope upward through the clay bank to ensure reliable draft without creating a pressure differential that would pull cold air down into the firebox. The physics of this were interesting if you let them be. She was asleep before she had finished working it out. This was the only night Verity Briggs cried in the ravine. Not because she was strong, because after that night she was too busy. And busy is the best possible medicine for the kind of grief that does not come from a single wound, but from the accumulated cost of understanding a situation clearly over a long period of time. She finished the chimney channel on the 9th day. 12 feet of horizontal passage cut into the clay bank starting from the firebox recess she had hollowed out against the cliff face, running back into the hillside at a slope of roughly 1 foot of rise for every 4 feet of run. She packed the walls of the channel with flat limestone slabs to prevent collapse, cutting them from a section of talus on the ravine's west wall that had enough flat-faced material for the purpose. The mouth of the channel she lined with fired clay that she produced by building a small fire in the recess and feeding it until the surrounding clay had hardened to a reddish-brown surface that would not crumble under sustained heat. The outlet emerged behind the bur oak roots on the upper bank, which she reached by climbing the ravine wall on the outside and following the surface until she found the place where the channel broke through. She pressed her hand over it and felt the air moving. The right direction. The right pressure. Enough draft to pull smoke the length of the passage without enough pull to create a cold air downdraft when the fire was banked. She went back to Millhaven that day. She had avoided the town since arriving at the ravine, which was easy enough because she had enough food for 2 weeks if she was careful, and she had been careful. But the iron firebox she needed was not something she could make from ravine materials. She had priced it in advance in the days before she left the Prescott house and knew that the hardware store on the east end of Millhaven's Main Street carried the model she wanted for $11.20. She paid in cash. She gave no name. She paid for the delivery herself, hiring the hardware man's boy to haul the box on a borrowed mule to the Persing Road junction north of town, where she collected it herself and loaded it across the horse's back for the half-mile walk to the ravine rim. Getting the box down the ravine wall took most of the afternoon and the entire contents of her patience. 140 pounds of cast iron does not negotiate with the angle of a limestone slope. She rigged a rope around a tree at the rim and lowered the box in stages, controlling the descent with her body weight and the friction of the rope around the oak, stopping every few feet to reset her footing and check the angle. The box swung and grated and scraped against the limestone twice each time, producing a sound she could hear a quarter mile in any direction. She waited after each sound, listening for any response from the world above, and when none came, she continued. The box reached the ravine floor intact. She had spent $31.20. She had $9.80 remaining. She had a firebox and a chimney and a wall. On the 14th day, she laid the floor. The floor was split oak deadfall from the ravine rim, where the previous winter's ice storm had brought down 3 large trees and left the trunks where they fell. The wood was already dry, having been off the tree since January. She split the sections using the adze and a stone wedge she fashioned from a piece of chert, working the grain with the adze blade to produce boards of approximately uniform width. She worked slowly because the adze requires accuracy more than force, and accuracy requires patience. And she had learned in 14 days of building that patience in the ravine was not a virtue. It was a technique. She laid the boards in 2 layers on a base of leveled clay, the lower layer running east to west, and the upper layer running north to south. The subfloor principle she had seen applied in the Prescott house when a section of kitchen floor had been replaced 2 years before. 2 layers set perpendicular to each other created a structure that distributed load across the grain of both layers, which was more rigid than either layer alone, and which would also provide some insulation against the cold of the limestone beneath, which was not nothing. On the 14th day, late in the afternoon, Verity stood in the center of the finished space and turned around once. 11 feet deep, 18 feet wide, 8 feet tall, where the overhang met the top of the front wall, dropping to 6.5 at the back, where the clay bank curved down to meet the floor. Planked floor on leveled clay on limestone. 3 clay-cut shelves in the bank, face one at knee height, one at waist height, one at shoulder height. The firebox set against the back wall with the chimney channel running into the hillside behind it. The doorway in the front wall, framed by 2 flat-faced stones set on end, with a piece of canvas she had bought in Millhaven hung from a length of rope strung between the lintel stones. She had spent 14 days and $31.20. Everything else she had cut, shaped, and fitted from what the ravine provided. It was smaller than any room she had ever lived in. It was the first space in 28 years of her life that belonged entirely to her, without anyone's permission. She moved in on a Thursday in mid-October, not with ceremony. She untied the canvas panel to let the afternoon light in, laid her bedroll on the oak platform she had built on stone legs to keep it off the floor, set her sewing kit on the middle shelf she had cut into the clay bank, and lit the firebox for the first time. She fed it dry oak splits until the firebox walls were hot, then packed it with green wood to bank it for the night. The smoke went where she had designed it to go. She stood outside this doorway and looked up at the bur oak roots on the upper bank. Nothing visible. The air above the roots showed nothing in the afternoon light. She waited until dusk and looked again. A faint shimmer barely there, the kind of thing you would only notice if you were specifically looking for it and knew what to look for. She waited for the air temperature to drop another 10 degrees and looked a third time. Nothing that anyone riding the property road above would look at twice. She went inside. She pulled the canvas panel across the doorway. She sat on the edge of the platform with her hands in her lap and listened to the firebox working and the creek running outside and the ravine settling into its nighttime register, which was quieter than the day by a margin she was learning to measure. The second problem had been solved as well as it could be solved. Now she needed to keep herself alive through winter. She went to Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in late October, 7 days after moving in. She had spent the 7 days checking the ravine for everything she had missed in the first 2 weeks. The places where the walls settled and needed to be shimmied, the drainage behavior of the ravine floor after a night of rain, the way the firebox temperature behaved in the enclosed space, and what she needed to sustain the heat through the night without burning through more fuel than the ravine could provide. She had a list by Tuesday. She had specific requirements, and she had a plan for how to meet them that did not require her to explain herself to anyone. The dry goods store was on the main street of Millhaven. She had observed it twice during the planning period, once from across the street and once from the barber's bench near the front window, and she had developed a clear picture of its proprietor. Emmett Gale was 50 years old approximately. He had the build of a man who had done physical work for the first part of his life and had been doing something more sedentary for the second part, broad through the chest and shoulders, but with the slight forward curl that comes from years of leaning over a counter. His hair was gray at the temples. His face was weathered in the way of men who spend time outdoors in all weather without much thought to the effect. He was not a man who smiled at customers by default, and he was not a man who offered more conversation than the transaction required. Verity had watched him for 2 days. She had watched him process a dozen customers, and what she had seen was a man who paid attention. He listened to what people said and responded to exactly what they had said, not to what he expected them to say. He did not anticipate or embellish. He weighed a measure of flour, and it was the correct measure, not a generous one, and not a short one, because the correct measure was what had been requested, and what had been requested was what he provided. That quality, she had decided, was the quality she needed. She went in on a Tuesday and stood at the counter and stated the arrangement in plain terms. She would take orders for seamstress work through his counter. Customers would leave fabric and instructions at the store. She would collect them every Tuesday. She would return finished work every Friday. Payment would pass through the counter. He would not need to know where she lived, where she worked, or what her name was before the one she was using now, which was Briggs, which had always been her name and was her name again. Emmett Gale looked at her for a longer time than she had seen him look at anything. His eyes were gray and steady and did not carry the quality of a man deciding whether to trust a stranger. They carried the quality of a man reading a document, assessing its actual terms rather than its apparent terms, looking for what it required of him before he agreed to what it appeared to offer. He said, "What do you need from me besides the counter?" She said, "Your silence." He said, "I have plenty of it." He did not ask another question. Not that day, not in the 3 years that followed. He turned back to his ledger. She turned toward the door. And then he spoke once more without looking up, in the even tone that appeared to be the only tone available to him. He said, "I open at 7 on Tuesdays. I don't finish my coffee until 8. So don't expect conversation." Verity stopped walking. Something shifted in her chest, small and specific, like a window opening in a room that has been closed too long. A sound that began somewhere below her ribs and wanted to be a laugh, and that she caught before it reached her mouth because she was not yet reacquainted with that sensation, and because she was in the dry goods store on the main street of Millhaven, and it was not the time. She walked out into the October morning with 3 orders already waiting on the counter behind her. She rode north. November came. The creek dropped and steadied. The ravine held its temperature in a way that the open hillsides could not, the limestone walls absorbing the sun's thin warmth through the short days and releasing it through the long nights at a rate that was neither generous nor dramatic, but was consistent, which was more useful than either. The smell of the ravine in November was something she had not anticipated. Wet oak leaves decomposing along the walls, a rich, heavy scent that sat in the air like a presence. The mineral smell of the limestone itself, cold and permanent. The smell of a thing that does not change and does not care whether you notice it or not. And underneath both the smell of the oak smoke from the firebox, which moved through the clay channel and came out filtered and cool and barely present, a background note rather than a statement. She cut wood every morning. The ravine slopes above the cut had enough deadfall to provide for one person through a winter if she worked at it, and she worked at it. She dragged dead branches down the slopes to the ravine floor, broke them to length over a flat stone, and stacked them inside the front wall where they would stay dry. She cut green wood sparingly only when the deadfall ran short in a particular radius, and she cut it in the sections of the ravine that were not visible from the road above, and she cut it at mid-morning when any casual rider on the road above was unlikely to be present. December brought the first real test. Rain for 7 days straight, beginning on a Sunday and continuing without interruption through the following Saturday. Not a storm, but a siege, the sky dropping a steady gray curtain of water at a rate that the ravine floor could not absorb quickly enough. The creek, which had been 4 feet wide and 6 inches deep in October, climbed to 8 feet wide by the third day and had crossed the ravine floor by the fourth running in a thin film across the packed clay, finding the slight downslope toward the creek channel, moving with the patient certainty of water that is going exactly where it has always gone. On the fourth evening, it reached the base of the plank floor. Verity sat on the sleeping platform with her feet drawn up and watched the water move across the boards. The planks were set on clay, which was absorbent to a point. Past that point, the clay would saturate and the water would pool beneath the boards. And pooled water beneath unsecured planks in an enclosed space produced exactly the outcome she had been looking at since the third day the boards would float. When they floated, they would shift. The floor she had spent 4 days fitting and leveling would disassemble itself without any force being applied to it, simply by following the law that objects in water move to where the water takes them. She sat on the platform and made the calculations she had learned to make in the past 2 months. Not what she felt about the situation, what the situation required. If the water rose another 12 inches, move the firebox to the platform. If the water rose another 24 inches, exit through the doorway, climb the wall to the ravine rim, wait on high ground. She had spare matches in the saddlebag, which was above the waterline on the shelf she had cut at shoulder height. She had 5 days of dried food. She had the horse at the rim, which she had checked the previous morning. She planned both scenarios in full. Then she sat on the platform and watched the water, because watching the water was the only information-gathering activity available to her at that moment, and she was a woman who did not waste time on things that were not either useful or necessary. The water reached the edge of the platform at 2 in the morning. She was still awake. She could feel the cold of it through the oak of the platform floor, 3 inches of cold water resting against the base of the structure on which she sat. Then the water held. For 6 hours it held at that level. The creek outside was running heavy and fast, and the ravine floor was submerged, and the water that came into the space stopped at the edge of the platform and went no further. She did not understand exactly why until later, when she found the seam in the ravine wall that was draining the lower floor into the creek channel at roughly the same rate the water was coming in. But she did not need to understand it that night. She only needed to know that it was holding. By morning, the water was receding. The floor was wet, the lower surface of the planks dark with absorbed moisture, but every board was where she had laid it. The structure was intact. The firebox sat on its clay shelf undisturbed. The canvas panel she had taken off the doorframe and hung on the upper shelf above the waterline was dry. She climbed down from the platform before the sun was fully up and began digging. She cut a drainage channel along the inside base of the front wall, with the adze sloping it toward the doorway, and then continuing through the ravine floor in a line to the creek channel. She lined it with limestone rubble, and packed the edges with clay. The work took 4 days because she did not stop until it was correct. She did not eat a full meal in those 4 days because eating took time and the channel was not finished. She slept 5 hours a night because the channel was not finished. When it was finished, she ate a full meal and slept 8 hours. She had learned something from the flood that she could not have learned any other way. The ravine was not hers. She lived in it. She had built in it. She had shaped it to her purposes and would continue to shape it. But it belonged to the water and the stone and the 60 million years of geology that had carved it, and it would remind her of this whenever it chose. She would adapt or she would leave. There was no third option. This was not a lesson she resented. It was a lesson she respected the way her father had taught her to respect a saw, by understanding that the tool does not care about your intentions, only about whether you are holding it correctly. The first winter passed and the second summer came, and with it the specific satisfaction of a person who has survived something that required their full capacity and has emerged on the other side, knowing precisely and without speculation what they are capable of. She had her 3 customers through Emmett Gale's counter. She had added 2 more by spring word, having moved through the women of Millhaven in the reliable fashion of women who have found something that works and want it to be available. She had earned enough to replace the food stores she had consumed through winter and to purchase 2 items she had been thinking about since November, a better tin pot and a second wool blanket. She planted wild mint by the creek entrance to the ravine in April. She found it growing upstream and transplanted 3 clumps into the damp soil beside the doorway, spacing them with the same attention she had given to the kitchen garden on the Prescott farm, thinking about the sun and the moisture and the drainage. Her mother had grown mint by the back door of the house where Verity had grown up. There was no practical reason to grow it in the ravine. Mint did not feed you or keep you warm or contribute to the structural integrity of a limestone shelter. But Verity wanted to smell it in the morning when she stepped outside, and wanting something for no reason other than wanting it was a thing she had not allowed herself in so long that the act of pressing 3 clumps of mint roots into the mud felt almost reckless. She did it anyway. On a Tuesday in July of the second summer, she came to Emmett Gale's counter to collect her orders and found beside the 3 wrapped packages a small parcel of brown paper with no label. She stood at the counter and looked at it. She unwrapped it. 3 sewing needles. Size 9. Fine gauge, the kind used for leatherwork, in heavy canvas, harder to push through dense fabric, but capable of carrying a heavier thread without bending. She looked at Emmett Gale behind the counter. He did not look at her. He was writing in his ledger, the pencil moving in the small, precise strokes of a man for whom handwriting is a form of measurement. She said, "How much?" He said, "No charge." She said, "I pay for what I receive." He set down the pencil. He did not look up. His voice was the same flat, even instrument it always was, delivering information without editorial content. He said, "You've been using 7s on heavy fabric. I can tell from the stitch spacing in your last 3 orders. 9s will hold better on hide and canvas both." Verity stood at the counter. She had been using size 7 needles on heavy fabric for 3 years. The same needles her mother had taught her, with the same needles she had always used because they were the needles she had, and she had never thought to question them. They worked. They produced seams that held. She had not considered that a different needle might produce seams that held better because she had not had anyone looking at her work closely enough to notice the difference. Emmett Gale had been looking at her stitch spacing. The least talkative man in Millhaven County had been examining the specific technical quality of her work with enough attention to identify her needle gauge from the finished product. Not because she was a charity case, not because he was doing her a favor in the sense that favors require an acknowledgement of disparity between parties, because he had noticed a detail about the work she did and the detail was correctable and he had corrected it. She stood at the counter for a moment longer than she needed to. She picked up the needles. She put them in her coat pocket. She walked out of the store and mounted the horse and rode north along the Millhaven Road with the needles in her pocket and a feeling in her chest that she could not name right away. She named it that evening, sitting on the platform with the firebox unlit in the July heat, turning the needles in her palm in the last of the late light that came through the gap between the top of the wall and the rock ceiling. Being known, not fully, not deeply, but accurately in one specific particular by one specific person who had paid attention without being asked to. She had not been known even in this small way since she had left her father's house. And the feeling of it, small and precise as a single well-placed stone in a wall, was the thing that kept her still on the platform for a long time after the light was gone. In the autumn of 1891, the land changed hands. She learned this not from anyone who told her, but from the evidence of the survey crew she saw working the southern field one morning when she climbed the east ravine wall to check the condition of the bur oak roots around the chimney outlet. 3 men with a transit in a chain measuring in the methodical fashion of people being paid by the work rather than the hour. She understood what this meant. Edmund Prescott was selling the land. She went back into the ravine and thought about it. The sale itself did not threaten her. A new owner of the surface land acquired the same view of the ravine that the previous owner had always had, which was the drainage ditch, a non-arable cut that generated no revenue and required no maintenance. A new owner had no particular reason to walk down into it. The survey crew she knew would not follow her there because surveyors measured arable land and described everything else as non-arable drainage and moved on. What the sale meant was that Edmund Prescott would walk the property before the papers were signed. It was the kind of thing a man like Edmund would do, not from sentiment, but from the same instinct that made him check his fence posts and his roof and his tools before he traded or sold them. The instinct that what you have owned for a long time, you should look at clearly before you release it. She put out the fire. She moved the firebox ash to the chimney channel. She sealed the canvas panel so that no line of light showed around its edges from outside. She placed the saddlebags on the upper shelf and covered them with a flat stone. She checked the exterior of the wall from the ravine path below, checking for any line or angle that did not match the surrounding limestone. She found two places where a stone had dried lighter than its neighbors, and she wet them with creek water until the color matched. Then she waited. 3 days after she had seen the survey crew, she heard the footsteps on the road above. Not the loose forward-falling footstep of a younger man. The deliberate, careful footstep of a man in his 60s who has given up nothing but pace. She heard the cane before she heard the boots, the tap of iron on stone, and she recognized from the pattern of it the particular way Edmund Prescott set his cane down before he shifted his weight, a habit she had observed across 4 years of meals and passages through the house. She pressed her back against the clay wall and did not move. The footsteps came along the road and stopped, directly above her. 30 feet of stone and air between his boots and the ceiling of the space where she slept. She could hear his breathing, the slightly labored sound of a man who had climbed a slope he no longer climbed easily. The cane tapped once, a sound she had come to recognize as the sound of Edmund settling his weight and looking at something. He was looking down into the ravine. She counted. She had learned this over 2 years in the ravine, that counting gave her body a signal that someone was still managing the situation. 1 to 60, then again, she could hear the creek. She could hear the wind in the bare trees above the ravine rim. She could hear the specific quiet of a man who has stopped moving and is studying something, the quality of stillness that belongs to a person who is looking and thinking about what he sees. The wall from above was limestone in a ravine, the same gray rubble that lined 600 feet of the cut in both directions, the same muted colors of weathered Missouri limestone on an October afternoon. No edge too straight, no course too regular. Nothing that the eye of a man who called this place the drainage ditch and had not once in 40 years of ownership climbed down into it would stop at. The cane tapped again. The footsteps resumed moving away, going north along the road toward the property's edge, where the new owner's surveyor had set the boundary pin. She sat in the dark behind her wall with her knees drawn up and her back against the warm clay, and listened to the sound of Edmund Prescott's footsteps retreating along the road above the roof of her house. She was aware of the specific quality of the moment, and she let herself be aware of it without trying to name it, because some things are most honestly experienced as sensation before they are reduced to words. When the footsteps were gone entirely, she sat for another 20 minutes in the quiet. Then she opened the canvas panel and let in the autumn light and began to rebuild the fire. Part 3, the cost of being found and the choice to leave. The newspaper scrap came in on a March wind. She found it on a Monday morning caught in the bur oak roots above the chimney outlet, where the wind that moved along the ridge left small deposits of the world below. Leaves and seed casings, and occasionally a scrap of paper that had made its way from the road or the town or some further distance she could not calculate. She pulled it free while checking the roots for winter damage, the way she did every morning in early spring, making sure the frost had not heaved any of the limestone around the outlet enough to change the draft. She unfolded it. It was a quarter page from the Millhaven County Gazette. The printing was smeared on one edge where moisture had gotten to it, and the lower portion had been torn away at some point before the wind took it. What remained was a column of community notices, and below that, set in slightly larger type, the beginning of an obituary. She read it standing on the upper bank, with the early March light coming flat and pale across the ridge. Emmett Gale, aged 51, proprietor of Gale's Dry Goods Millhaven, survived by his wife Vera, passed in his place of business on the morning of the 14th, discovered by his wife at 9 o'clock. Service to be held Friday at the Methodist Church. In lieu of flowers donations to the Millhaven Widows Fund, the rest had been torn away. Verity stood on the bank with the paper in her hands and read it twice. Then she folded it along the original crease, the careful crease of a document that someone had folded with attention before the wind got to it, and she carried it down into the ravine and set it on the upper shelf beside her sewing kit, and she sat on the platform and did not move for a long time. She did not cry. She had allocated her tears to one night on cold stone in October of 1889, and she had not reopened that account. But she sat with a stillness that was different in quality from her usual stillness, which was the stillness of a person listening for something specific. This was the stillness of a person absorbing a loss that she had not prepared for because she had not understood until the loss arrived that there was something to lose. Emmett Gale had been the only person on earth who knew where she was. Not because she had told him. She had told him nothing beyond what the arrangement required. She had told him her name and her schedule and what she needed and what she was offering in return. She had not told him she was living in a ravine on the north edge of the former Prescott land. She had not told him anything about her circumstances at all. But a man who looked at 3 orders of seamstress work and identified the needle gauge from the stitch spacing was not a man who was failing to draw conclusions from the information available to him. He had known. She was certain of it. And he had held that knowledge for 2.5 years without once asking what she was doing with her life or why she was living it the way she was, because that was what Emmett Gale considered his business, and that was what he did not consider his business. And the line between those two categories was as precise and consistent in him as his ledger entries. He had held her secret not as a secret, as a fact that was none of his business. And now he was in the ground behind the Methodist church and the last thread connecting her to the town of Millhaven, the thin, reliable line that ran through his counter and kept her tethered to a source of income, and therefore to the continued possibility of staying in the ravine through another winter, had not been cut by her choice or by his. It had been cut by the only force that operates without negotiation. She sat on the platform until the March light shifted from morning to afternoon. Then she stood up and went to check the snare lines she had set along the ravine's upper slopes, because the snares needed to be checked and they did not care about the contents of a newspaper. What happened in the dry goods store after Emmett died was told to her later in pieces by Dorothea, who had assembled the pieces from what Vera had told her and what other people in Millhaven had noticed without understanding what they were noticing. Vera Gale found the obituary notice in order and the business papers in order because Emmett had kept everything in order, which was the kind of man he was. She also found in the back of the ledger, behind the last page of entries, a note in his handwriting. Small and precise, the handwriting of a man who treated words on paper with the same economy he applied to words spoken aloud. North Ravine, Prescott land. Do not disturb. Vera read it twice. She did not understand it. She put it in the stove. She also found in the ledger's entries themselves 2 years of payments recorded to a V. Briggs. 47 entries totaling $61, all marked with a small notation in the right margin that she did not understand at first and then understood to mean uncollected, because the last entry was from the previous October, which was when the deliveries and collections had stopped. She placed a notice in the Gazette. There was no response. This was what Vera told Dorothea several weeks after the funeral, during the kind of conversation that two women have on a Sunday after church when one of them has been carrying something and has finally found someone she trusts enough to set it down for a moment. She mentioned the note, the North Ravine, the strange uncollected money, Emmett's particular quality of silence on the subject of the seamstress who collected work through his counter. Dorothea listened. She listened the way she listened to everything that mattered, which was without expression and without hurry, letting each piece settle into the place it occupied before she moved to the next. And as Vera talked, Dorothea felt the pieces she had been holding separately for 2.5 years connect to the pieces Vera was offering, with the quiet internal sound of a thing coming into alignment. North Ravine, Prescott land. Verity had ridden north on the morning she left. Not south, not east, north toward the Prescott property line, toward the timber and whatever lay beyond it. Dorothea had watched her go. She had noted the direction. She had held it for 2.5 years in the deep, organized place where she kept the things she saw and did not yet know what to do with. She knew now. Constance Webb was 30 years old, the wife of the Methodist minister, and she believed in community with the same absolute conviction that Edmund Prescott had believed in land. She organized, she visited, she brought things to people and took other things from them, specifically the isolation she considered a condition requiring correction. She was warm in the genuine way and persistent in the relentless way, and the combination made her the most effective and the most dangerous woman in Millhaven, depending on whether you wanted what she was offering. She had noticed the seamstress work coming through Emmett's counter 2 years before, had noticed the quality of it, which was not merely competent, but exceptional, the work of someone who had been taught correctly and had then spent years refining the technique until it stopped being technique and became something closer to instinct. She had commissioned a shirt for her husband and received it and turned it inside out and examined every seam with the attention of a woman who had been running a household for 8 years and knew what good work looked like when she was holding it. After Emmett died and the arrangement at the counter stopped, Constance began asking around. Not maliciously. She did not have a malicious nature. She was doing what she always did, which was identifying a person she believed might need something and then pursuing that person with the patient thoroughness of someone who considered her own persistence to be a form of charity. She asked Vera. She asked the women who had used the counter arrangement. She asked the hardware man. She asked the barber. Verity watched this from across the street. She made several Tuesday morning trips to Millhaven in the weeks after Emmett's death for supplies she genuinely needed, and on two of those Tuesdays she observed Constance Webb moving through the commercial district of Millhaven with the focused energy of a woman conducting a search. Verity sat on the bench outside the apothecary and drank the coffee she had bought inside and watched Constance go in and out of the dry goods store, the hardware store, the post office, and she understood with the cold clarity that 2.5 years in the ravine had given her that the greatest threat to everything she had built was not winter and was not flood and was not the Prescott family. It was the goodwill of a stranger who believed that a woman living alone was a woman in distress and who intended to provide relief whether the woman wanted relief or not. She was in the ravine on an afternoon in early April when she heard the sound on the ravine path. Not hoofbeats, footsteps. Slow and careful, the footsteps of someone descending a slope that required attention. A cane touching stone. She had heard a cane on these slopes before and had pressed herself against the clay wall and not moved. But this cane had a different rhythm. Not the decisive, measured tap of a man covering familiar ground. The careful, intermittent tap of a person who was taking their time because their knees required it. She stood up from the platform and moved to the doorway and pulled the canvas panel aside an inch. Dorothea Vane was at the bottom of the ravine, 20 feet from the wall. She had come down the east side following the path that ran along the base of the cliff, using the same limestone outcroppings for footholds that Verity had used when she first came down 18 months ago. She was wearing her work clothes. Her hair was up. She held the cane in her right hand, and she was breathing with the deliberate control of a woman who has been using breath management to overrule her body's objections for many years. She reached the ravine floor and stood still and looked at the wall. Verity watched her from behind the canvas panel. She watched Dorothea's face as the woman looked at what was in front of her, the 18 feet of dry stacked limestone fitted with a precision that had required 14 days of sustained work and 2.5 years of maintenance and improvement. The doorway, the gap at the top where the light came in, the bur oak roots above the upper rim trailing down against the cliff face like the fingers of a hand. Dorothea's face did not show surprise. It showed something quieter and more durable. The expression of a person recognizing a shape they have been trying to imagine for a long time and finding that the reality is larger than the imagination. She said Verity. One word spoken at normal conversational volume, neither a call nor a whisper. The word of a woman who had considered the situation and decided on the direct approach. Silence. The creek ran, the wind moved through the ravine. Then Dorothea said, I know you're there. I haven't told anyone. I came alone. I only want to know that you're alive. Verity let the canvas panel fall back into place. She stood behind it for a moment, not from hesitation, but from the specific internal rearrangement that happens when you have been unseen for a long time and are about to become seen. The rearrangement required a moment. She gave it one. Then she pushed the panel aside and stepped into the doorway. Dorothea looked at her. She looked at her the way she had always looked at things, directly and without performance, reading what was actually there rather than what she expected or hoped. She looked at the short, practical haircut and the patched dress that had been mended in several places with the same invisible stitching that characterized every piece of work Verity had sent through Emmett's counter. She looked at the hands, the calloused knuckles, and the small scars and the nails cut close to the quick. The hands of someone who had been doing sustained physical work in conditions that were not designed for comfort. She looked at the posture, which was not the posture Verity had carried in the Prescott house, the careful, self-contained posture of a woman in a space she did not control. This was the posture of a woman in a doorway she had built. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, You built all of this? Verity said yes. Dorothea looked past her into the space of the plank floor and the clay shelves and the firebox against the back wall, and the light coming through the gap at the top of the front wall in a bright horizontal band across the floor, moving slowly the way light moves in the late afternoon when the sun is dropping toward the ridge. She stepped forward. She came through the doorway. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, reading it the way Verity had learned to read a space, with attention, not looking for anything specific, simply letting the space tell her what it was. She sat on the edge of the platform. Verity put water on the firebox. She had dried mint from the previous autumn, the mint she had planted beside the doorway a year ago for no practical reason, and she put a handful of it in the tin pot and waited for the water to come to heat. She poured 2 cups, both tin, both the same, and she handed one to Dorothea and sat beside her on the platform. They drank mint tea in the April afternoon with the creek outside and the wind in the oak roots, and the limestone of the overhang above them, old and indifferent and solid in the way of things that have been solid for a very long time. Dorothea said, "You spent 4 years in the Prescott house, and you learned how to build a home. I spent 30 years living next to the Prescott house, and all I ever learned was how to endure." Verity held the tin cup in both hands and said nothing, because what Dorothea had said was not a question and was not a statement that needed a response. It was a reckoning offered out loud, the kind of thing a woman says when she has been thinking it for a long time and has finally found the right person in the right place to say it to. They sat together for a while longer. The firebox made its ticking sound. The creek ran. Then Dorothea stood. Her knees registered their usual protest, and she overruled them with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been having this conversation with her body for years. She walked to the doorway and turned back. She said, "I won't come back unless you ask me to. But if you need anything, you know where my house is." Then she climbed out of the ravine slowly and without hurry, and she did not look back. Verity stood in the doorway and watched her go until the sound of the cane on the limestone path had faded to nothing. Constance Webb came to Dorothea's house on a Saturday in May. She came with the focused purpose of a woman who had narrowed her search to its final candidate and was ready to conclude. She had spent 6 weeks working through Millhaven's available information, and the conclusion of that work was that the seamstress who had passed work through Emmett Gale's counter for 2 years was most likely Verity Briggs, formerly Prescott, formerly of this county, who had departed the Prescott farm in October of 1889, and whose whereabouts since that departure no one in Millhaven could account for. She stood in Dorothea's kitchen and explained this with the earnest clarity of a woman who was proud of the quality of her reasoning and who wanted to help someone who had clearly been struggling alone for too long. Dorothea listened. She listened to all of it, the reasoning, the evidence, the concern, the genuine warmth behind the concern, which Dorothea recognized as genuine because she had lived long enough to know the difference between performed warmth and the real kind, and Constance Webb's was real. That was what made this difficult. When Constance had finished, Dorothea said Verity Briggs went to Springfield. Her sister is there. She's been there since the winter of '89. She said it clearly and without hesitation in the steady conversational voice she used for statements of fact. She held Constance's eyes while she said it because she knew that a lie told to the floor is a lie that folds under the weight of its own doubt. She felt the lie leave her mouth. She had not lied in 8 years. Not since her husband died and the particular social performances that marriage requires ended along with it. She was a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said, and this principle had cost her things over the years. Friendships and courtesies and the easy warmth of people who prefer pleasantness to accuracy. She had considered that cost acceptable because the alternative was becoming a person she did not respect. The lie leaving her mouth felt like a bone breaking. Not painful exactly. Wrong. A fundamental violation of the way things were supposed to work. But she was not lying to protect herself. She was lying to honor the only request Verity had ever made of her, which was not made with words, but with the act of a woman who had seen a bundle of food hanging on a branch at the trailhead and chosen not to take it because taking it meant being known, and being known meant being found. Verity had asked without asking to be left alone, the clearest possible way a person can make that request. Dorothea had received it. She was honoring it. Constance believed her. Or she chose to believe her, which amounted to the same thing in practice, because questioning the word of a 60-year-old widow who had lived in this county for 30 years and whose character was not in doubt required a willingness to make an accusation that Constance did not have, which was to the woman's credit. She thanked Dorothea for the information. She left. She turned her attention to other women in Millhaven who needed what she had to offer, and in time the question of the seamstress through Emmett's counter became one of those small mysteries that small towns carry without resolution, a detail that is occasionally mentioned and never explained. Dorothea sat at her kitchen table after Constance left and looked at the wall for a long time. She did not feel good about the lie. She did not expect to feel good about it. Lies told for good reasons were still lies, and a woman of her age and character was not going to pretend otherwise simply because the reason was sound. She had done what was necessary. She had done it knowing the count, and she would carry the cost without making a performance of carrying it. She got up and fed the chickens. Spring moved through the ravine in the way that spring moved through ravines, which was earlier and more noticeably than it moved through open land, the walls catching and amplifying the increasing warmth of the sun in a way that made the season feel more deliberate in the cut than it did on the slopes above. The creek warmed from the surface down. The moss on the ravine walls went from its winter gray to a vivid particular green that had no equivalent in the palette of any other season. The bur oak roots above the chimney outlet put out pale new leaves that filtered the morning light into something soft and shifting. Verity planted the garden. She had been preparing the soil in a patch beside the east wall since February, turning it and improving it with ash from the firebox and leaf mold she had been collecting from the ravine floor since the previous autumn. In April, she pressed seeds into the prepared ground corn from the small stores she had been saving since her first summer in the ravine ramps, transplanted from the north-facing slope upstream. The late squash she had been growing from saved seed for 2 seasons. She planted carefully, thinking about the sun and the drainage and the particular way the ravine's walls would concentrate the warmth on the mouth-facing plot. She was not planting to produce surplus. She was planting because planting was the thing she did, the thing she had always done, the thing she understood in her hands better than she understood most things in her mind. The garden at the Prescott farm had been the truest expression of herself that she had managed in 4 years of marriage, and they had kept it, and it had died without her, and she was growing a different one now in different soil, with different walls and different light, and entirely at her own direction. She was not thinking about the Prescott garden when she planted. She was thinking about soil temperatures and germination rates and the angle of the June sun above the ravine rim. But her hands knew what they were doing, and what her hands were doing was making a claim. The second summer was the summer Verity learned to read the weather from the creek. She had been reading the creek for a year by that point, but reading it the way you read a thing when you are still learning its language slowly and with effort and with the awareness that you are missing things. In the second summer, it became something else. The creek's language became her first language. In that space, the way a language becomes the language you dream in when you have lived in it long enough. A drop of 2 inches in 3 days meant dry weather pressing down from the northwest. A rise of 1 inch overnight with no rain meant snowmelt on the upper ridges, which meant cold water for 4 days regardless of the air temperature. The sound of the creek in August, the particular thin voice it had when the water was low and clear and the stones were exposed, was different in quality from the sound of the creek in May, which was fuller and less distinct, the water having more to say and saying it louder because the channel was full. She learned these distinctions not by studying them, but by living alongside them, the way you learn anything you cannot choose to stop paying attention to. She also discovered in the second summer that a fox had denned in the west wall of the ravine 50 feet downstream from her doorway. She saw it first as a russet flash in the last light of an evening in June, moving along the base of the wall with the confident, unhurried pace of an animal that considers itself the primary occupant of a territory. She watched for it in the mornings and evenings after that and saw it often enough to establish the outline of its routine. She did not interfere with the fox. The fox did not interfere with her. The arrangement had a clarity that she appreciated, the clarity of 2 creatures who had assessed each other and arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the ravine was large enough for both of them and that neither party had anything to gain from testing the other. It was the most uncomplicated relationship she had in the year following Emmett's death. In the autumn of 1892, her third autumn in the ravine, Verity made a decision about the work. She had been thinking about it since May, since the Tuesday she had stood across the street and watched Constance Webb moving through Millhaven with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. The arrangement through Emmett's counter had been protected by Emmett's silence and by the fact that the arrangement's mechanics were opaque to anyone who was not inside them. Without Emmett, the arrangement had no such protection. Its replacement, whatever it was, would have to manage without the particular quality of discretion that Emmett had provided simply by being who he was. But there was a deeper consideration. She was 31 years old. She had been in the ravine for 3 years. She had built what she intended to build. She had learned what the ravine had to teach her, and the learning had been specific and complete in the way that her father's teaching had always been specific and complete, not comprehensive in the sense of covering everything possible, but thorough in the sense of covering what was needed, the way a foundation covers the footprint of the structure that will stand on it and nothing more. She had enough money now to do what came next. She had more than enough, which was a condition she had never experienced before, and which felt in the ravine in the autumn of her 3rd year there like a form of information. The question was not whether to leave. The question was when. And the answer to when was not a date she could identify in advance. It was a condition she would recognize when she arrived at it. The condition of having finished. She was not finished yet. She could feel the not finished quality of it the way you feel the weather coming, not with any specific sensory evidence, but with the accumulated instinct of a person who has learned to read the signs. She stopped going to Millhaven for work. The Tuesday trips had become more exposure than they were worth now that the protection of the counter arrangement was gone and Constance Webb was an active presence in the commercial district. The $41 she had arrived with had grown through 3 years of careful work and careful spending to $112 in a new coat lining she had sewn herself from canvas and wool. She had enough. The trips to town had served their purpose. The thread connecting her to Millhaven went quiet. No ceremony, no announcement. Emmett would have understood this. He would have noted the absence of Tuesday visits in his ledger, as he noted everything, and he would have concluded whatever he concluded, and he would have kept that conclusion to himself as he kept everything. She missed him in the specific way she had missed her father after she married. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular awareness of an absence that had once been a presence. The awareness that something was not there that had been there, and that the world's character was slightly changed by the subtraction. The 3rd winter came cold and stayed cold. She had enough wood. She had cut more than enough starting in July and continuing through September because she had made the calculation the previous February of how much she had needed versus how much she had had, and the gap between those numbers was not one she intended to experience again. The woodpile against the south wall of the ravine was the largest she had accumulated, and it was the first winter in 3 years that she did not make the calculation of days remaining against fuel remaining and find the margin uncomfortably thin. The cold in January was the deepest she had experienced in the ravine. Single digits on the nights when the wind came straight from the northwest off the ridge, the kind of cold that does not feel like weather, but like a property of the air itself, as if the air had always been this temperature, and the warmer months were the aberration. Inside the space, the firebox ran steady, and the clay walls did what clay walls of sufficient mass do, which is absorb the heat slowly and release it slowly, and maintain a temperature in the enclosed space that bore no consistent relationship to the temperature outside. She was not warm in the way of a heated house. She was warm in the way of a thing that has been designed to conserve what it has, rather than generate what it lacks. This was a distinction she had understood since the first winter, and that she now lived inside so naturally that she no longer thought about it the way you stop thinking about a language once you've stopped translating and started thinking directly in it. She spent the long winter evenings with her sewing and with the specific kind of thinking that deep cold and firelight encourage, which is the thinking that does not pursue a conclusion, but circles around one, returning to the same point from different angles each time until the point becomes clear. The point she was circling was the question of finished. She had survived 4 winters in the ravine. She had built a home in a place that no one believed existed. She had fed herself and sheltered herself and maintained herself through floods and cold, and the sustained attention that a limestone ravine in Missouri demands of anyone who lives in it. She had done this without help, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing it was being done. She knew it. That was enough. That had always been enough. The knowing was hers, and it could not be taken or questioned or dismissed in 7 words by a man who had never walked to the end of the 2nd row. And she had saved $112, which was the practical knowledge that the theoretical knowledge had made possible, which was what knowledge was for. The answer came in February. She had been expecting it to come dramatically because she had been taught by the accumulated weight of stories that important things arrive with force, with a clear before and a clear after, with a moment that can be identified and pointed to later. She had been taught this by the same culture that had taught her that a marriage was the beginning of something rather than the beginning of an interval. The answer did not come dramatically. It came on an ordinary February morning when she stepped outside the doorway to check the weather before deciding how much wood to cut, and the creek was running low and clear in its February channel, which was the channel she had seen it run in for 3 years, and the frost was on the ravine walls in the specific way she had seen it on perhaps 100 mornings, and the bur oak roots above the chimney outlet were moving slightly in the ridge wind, and she stood there in the cold morning air and understood without effort and without surprise that she was done. Not done because the ravine had failed her, done because the ravine had succeeded. It had given her what she had come to build, which was not just shelter and not just income and not just invisibility, although it had given her all of those. It had given her the proof. The specific, undeniable, entirely personal proof that she could do the things she had done, and that the things she had done was something no one who knew her would have expected, and that their not expecting it was their limitation and not hers. The proof was in the wall and the floor, and the clay shelves in the chimney channel that ran 12 feet into the hillside, and the $112 in the coat lining, and the 3 years of Tuesday mornings at a counter run by a man who had never asked her a question she wasn't prepared to answer. She had the proof. She did not need to stay in the ravine to keep it. She would carry it the way her father had carried 40 years of carpenter's knowledge, not in a book and not in a building, but in her hands and her eyes and her habits of attention. It was hers in the way that only things you have earned by doing them are yours, completely and permanently impossible to confiscate. Staying longer would not add to it. Staying longer would simply be staying. And Verity had not built this to become someone who stayed in a thing past the point of its usefulness. She went back inside and made coffee and began thinking about what came next, which was a different and more interesting kind of thinking than the circling she had been doing all winter. She spent March preparing to leave, not quickly and not with the 3-day urgency of her departure from the Prescott farm. She had time and she used it properly. She checked every element of the structure with the eye of a builder doing a final inspection, not looking for problems to fix, but assessing what she was leaving, what condition it was in, how long it would stand without her. The front wall solid. 3 years of frost and thaw and the seasonal flooding of the ravine floor had not shifted a single stone. She pressed each course in sequence, working from the base upward, and the wall had answered her with the particular unmoving firmness of a thing that has found its equilibrium. The clay bank shelves were intact, the cut still sharp-edged. After 3 years, here, the clay hardened to something close to stone by the heat from the firebox and the accumulated pressure of the objects that had rested on them. The chimney channel she checked by lighting a small fire in the firebox and watching the smoke until she was satisfied with the draw, then banking the fire and watching the channel outlet above until she was satisfied that nothing visible was escaping. The floor she would leave. It had served its purpose, and it was part of the structure now fitted to the space the way the space fitted the hillside, each element belonging to its place. Taking the planks would leave gaps in the clay that the winter water would use. She left everything. On the last day, she took down the canvas panel. She folded it and packed it with her sewing kit and the adze, which had been sharpened so many times over 3 years that the blade was noticeably narrower than it had been on the October morning. She carried it down the ravine wall, reduced by use and maintenance to something even closer to essential than it had been before. She packed the bedroll and the coat with the $112 in the lining and the tin pot in the composition book in which she had kept every financial record of 3 years in the ravine, every penny in and every penny out in handwriting that Emmett Gale would have recognized as the writing of someone who treated numbers with the same precision. She brought to stitching. She stood in the space one last time. Without the canvas panel, the afternoon light came through the doorway and the gap at the top of the front wall and lay across the floor in bands, moving the way light moves in enclosed space when the sun is at the right angle, slowly and with a quality that felt almost deliberate. The clay walls held their warmth. The firebox was cold, the shelves were empty, the floor was swept. She looked at the marks on the clay bank above the upper shelf, the record she had kept since the second month. Small not-shed marks cut with the corner of the adze one for each week she had been there. She had not counted them in over a year. She did not count them now. She knew approximately how many there were, and the number was not the point. The point was that each one had been made, and that each one represented a week in which she had been exactly what the situation required, and that the sum of them was the specific gravity of what she was carrying out of the ravine. She climbed the wall one last time, using the same limestone outcropping she had used on the first day, and she untied the horse from the oak at the rim, and she loaded the saddlebags and mounted. She did not look back at the ravine. She had said goodbye to it the way she had built it, without an audience and without ceremony, and the goodbye was complete by the time she was in the saddle. Verity was not a woman who confused the leaving of a thing with the performance of leaving it. She rode south along the property road. She stopped at Dorothea's gate. It was a March morning, cold, in the way that March mornings are cold when the winter has not entirely released its intention, the frost still on the grass, the sun not yet over the ridge to the east. She tied the horse and walked to the porch and knocked. Dorothea came to the door in her house dress, her hair down, the hair that Verity had only ever seen pinned up under the work hat, or the church hat, now loose and gray, and longer than she had expected. She looked at Verity with the same direct, unashamed gaze she had turned on everything for 60 years. Verity said, "I'm leaving." Dorothea said nothing for a moment. She looked at the horse at the gate loaded with the saddlebags ready for a day's travel. She looked at Verity's face. She was doing what she always did, which was reading the actual situation rather than the apparent one. She said, "Are you finished?" Verity considered the question with the honesty it deserved, the way she considered every question that deserved honesty, which was without rushing and without dressing the answer in what sounded better than what was true. She said yes. "I'm finished." Dorothea nodded once. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that holds something the way a hand holds something before it releases it. Then she said, "The kitchen garden at the Prescott place. The new people didn't plant it. It died the first winter after you left." The words landed in the cold morning air between them and stayed there. Verity did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. 4 years of compost and planting and mapping the sunlight across every season. 4 years of the most particular knowledge applied to a particular piece of ground with the full attention of a woman who understood that attention was what turned soil into something that produced. The land that Edmund Prescott had kept because it was on Prescott land and therefore worth keeping. It had gone back to hard clay and pokeweed in one winter without her. The space where the garden had been was the shape of the argument she had been making since she walked out of that kitchen, except that she had been making it in a ravine where no one could see it, and the garden was making it on 40 acres of river-bottom farmland that anyone in Millhaven County could walk past on the road. Edmund Prescott had kept the land and lost the garden. She had taken the ads and the knowledge and the $41 and built something that no one knew was there, and it was standing, and it would stand when the Persing land changed hands again, and when whoever came after Persing walked the north boundary and found it and could not explain it. Dorothea had told her this not to wound her and not to comfort her. She had told her because it was true, and because Dorothea was a woman who believed that truth, even when it arrived with an edge, was a better thing to carry than ignorance. Verity turned back to the horse. She untied it from the gate and mounted. She gathered the reins. She looked at Dorothea on the porch, who was standing in the cold March morning in her house dress without her coat because she had come to the door quickly and had not thought to get it, and who was looking back at Verity with the expression of a woman who has kept a significant secret for a significant period of time and is now watching the secret walk away. Verity said thank you. She meant it to cover everything which it could not, but which it was the most accurate word available for. Dorothea nodded. Verity rode south. She did not look back at the house. She did not ride past the Prescott property for a final look at the ravine she had lived in and the wall she had built and the kitchen garden that had died. She had no interest in last looks. She had built her goodbye into the act of leaving itself, and the act was complete. And she was on a horse with $112 in her coat and an adze that had been in her family for 2 generations, and the specific, irreducible knowledge of a woman who had proved something to herself in a limestone ravine in the Missouri hills and did not need to prove it again. She rode toward the county road. The frost was still on the grass. The sun was coming over the ridge to the east. The horse moved at a walk steady and unhurried, covering ground. Behind her, somewhere north of the road and below the rim of the property, Persing now owned and would eventually sell to someone who would sell it to someone else. The wall she had built still stood in the ravine that the Prescotts had called the drainage ditch. The front wall with its fitted stones, the clay shelves, the firebox and the chimney channel that ran 12 feet into the hillside and emerged behind the beer oak roots. The plank floor on its leveled clay. All of it dry, all of it solid, all of it precisely as she had left it. 2 months later, Halbert Crane walked the north boundary on a Tuesday in May and found it. He stood in front of it for a while. He wrote in his notebook, possible old livestock, shelter condition, stable, no action required. He did not disturb it. He moved on to the next post in the next section of fence, doing the work that required boots and a notebook and very little thought, the same as always. And the ravine closed behind him, the way it had always closed, with the particular silence of a place that has learned to hold what is given to it without explanation and without the expectation of being understood. Verity Briggs did not disappear from Millhaven County in October of 1889. She simply did not appear. And that is a different thing entirely. It always has been.